James Quill had lived a very happy life up until he was captured. He lived in West Africa with his mom, dad, and sister Mary. At age 11, James and his sister were outside playing in the grass while their parents were inside minding the house.
Out of nowhere, two kidnappers came out and took advantage of the two children playing in their yard. One man grabbed James by the arm while the other tried to catch his sister. James and Mary appeared far away until they reached a small house where the kidnappers stopped for the night.
Here James and Mary were unable to eat, but the sleep was much needed. By the time they woke up, they were off again, and they headed to the ship that would be their home for the next 3 months.
James and his sister were taken to a ship to start their long journey to South Carolina. The captain of the ship, John Newton, liked to run a tight ship and didn't tolerate any chaos caused by the slaves. This caused worse conditions for the slaves because there was much tension between the sailors and the slaves.
On the ship, the conditions were horrible. The slaves were put below deck, packed with many people. They were crammed, standing shoulder to shoulder, with no room to move. With these circumstances, James lost sight of his sister and was never to be reunited with her again.
The smells on the ship were horrendous. The stench was described as intolerably loathsome, and it was impossible to stand the smell for a long period of time. Many people got sick from the smell, and a lot of the disease resulted in death. A lot of slaves would have rather died than suffer through the long voyage.
Although it was very difficult to do with the crew standing on deck and the net surrounding the boats, the slaves tried many of times to jump off the boat to commit suicide or rebel against the sailors by attacking them. If the slaves were caught, they were severely punished.
There were even more severe consequences if the slaves refused to eat the food that was provided. After 3 months of suffering from the terrible conditions of the ship, James and the rest of the slaves finally arrived in South Carolina.
Once off the ship, the slaves were taken to an auction to be sold to their owners. They were put in stalls like cattle and shown to the buyers. The men were called bucks and the women wenches. At times, the buyers would go up to the slaves and ask them to do simple tasks like jump and run in place.
The buyers did not care whether the slaves wanted to stay with their family or not, so most of the time families were split up. James was bought by a man named Josiah Quincy. Josiah Quincy took James and 5 other slaves to his tobacco plantation in South Carolina.
Josiah Quincy worked his slaves until the collapse of exhaustion at the end of each day. The house that the slaves lived in was extremely crammed and cold in the winter and hot in the summer. The slaves had to get up at the crack of dawn in order to start their work and were not permitted to stop working until it was dark. To eat, they only received a very little amount of corn, and if they were lucky, they got a variety of vegetables.
After 6 years of working hard for Josiah Quincy, James and 4 of his fellow slaves decided to make an escape. Late at night in the pitch dark, the 5 slaves decided to follow the northern star to freedom.
One of the 5 slaves that was running away with James was Maggie Hart. Maggie and James created a mother-son relationship during the time that they were on the plantation. So while they were running away to freedom, Maggie and James guided each other on the long, dangerous journey.
There was a close encounter with bounty hunters, but fortunately enough, their tracks were hidden by the river they decided to walk through. Maggie and James both continued to Philadelphia, while the others head farther west.
James stayed in Philadelphia, where he found a wife and had a family to take care of. He found a low-paying job so he could provide for his family and hopefully someday forget the horrible experiences he went through as a slave.